The Darkangel, Chapter 5, Prince Erlath. So Iriel told the Darkangel tales, and fed his gargoyles, and spun and wove for his wives, and fished with the Durra in the quiet caves' pools, and the day months passed. She told him all the tales she could remember ever hearing from Bomba or Edwin, or anyone else she'd ever known. The vampire seemed to listen with only half an ear, remarking now and again on some improbability in the tale, but he did listen, and Iriel found no more broken bats or maimed lizards in the garden. But she found herself now at the last, as she began to work on the last of the wraith's garments, running short of tales. So she asked the Durra for tales, and he told her those he could remember from his nursery days in the caves of Adelan. 12,000 day months passed, and she told them to the vampire in the deserted reception hall of the castle, and he listened seemingly with no more attention than before. Then came the day she told him the tale of the chieftain's son who lived in the great palace called Tour of Kings. It was a tale that Durna had told her, for Durna had been of the plains folk before she was taken for a slave. Told Iriel the tale while combing out her fine yellow-tinged hair. It was late afternoon, almost dusk in the vampire's castle. The white sunlight streamed like water over the black slate floor. Iriel sat on the floor in the warmth of the sunlight while the Icarus stood by the window and picked a flower to pieces as she spoke. Iriel said, "This is a tale that Durna once told me, and it is the last tale I know. She told it to me one fortnight when we were quite alone to frighten me, and I do not know if it's true. This is the tale. There was once a woman who was handmaiden to a great chieftain of the plains, and this woman, Durna, had a child of a day-month old, when the chieftain's queen bore him a son. But the queen fell ill, and so Durna's child was taken from her that she might nurse the chieftain's son. But Durna mourned the loss of her child, and she grew to hate the child she nursed. Although she was but a serving woman, she vowed vengeance against the chieftain and bided her time. Now it became clear in the few seasons that the fever that had befallen the queen at the birth of her child had left her barren. So when the child had reached his 5th year of age, the queen and her train undertook a pilgrimage across the desert to consult the priestess of Lonwuri about her barrenness. So the pilgrimage was made to the shrines of the Lonwuri across the dry desert, and the queen remained in the sacred city for a year and her son with her. When all the prayers and the rituals and anointings were completed, the queen gathered her train and started back across the desert. They journeyed about 3/4 of their way over the waste of the dunes, when a great wind sprang up that raised the sand in clouds so thick they hid the stars. The caravan made a camp at once to wait out the storm, but it blew all day month and on into the shade of night. At last their water ran so low they had to break camp and try to reach the next oasis. The wind drove them on, and they wandered far off their course, till it was day again and the storm abated. They found themselves in a rocky place at the desert's edge, amid a maze of canyons on the shores of a great shallow lake. But something was amiss. The queen saw this at once, for nothing grew along the banks of this mere, or in it. A lonely howling as of jackals could be heard faintly from the canyons, though not a living creature was to be seen. And when the desert wind blew, not a ripple marred the dark water's surface. It lay, still as a mirror, and barren. Those camels that had been allowed to drink sickened and died. The queen ordered at once that no water skins to be filled at this waterhole, and no one was to drink, and they would move on. They wandered many hours in the gorges and the canyons, found themselves at the lake again. A second time they went into the rocks, and after such much meandering they found themselves emerging on the lake. Once more they emerged into the maze. Once more they emerged onto the mere. There were mutterings among the people and talks of witchcraft. A camp was made and council held to determine what could be done. Truly it seemed the gods were displeased. The queen's priests began to cast the oracle bones to divine the cause. It was a lengthy process and lasted many hours, for the lots were confounded and there was no magic in the counters. The water was all gone by now. The animals were dying, but no one dared drink the water of the wide, still lake. No one drank, that is, but Durna. Her thirst became so great that at last it overcame her fear, and she crept down to the water in the dark of the night, and while in the distance the unseen jackals sang, she lay down on the sandy bank and cupped her hands to the water. It was cold, colder than shadow, but she drank. She drank a handful and was just reaching for another when she saw something in the water. It was a small creature, no bigger than a hen, with smooth, translucent skin that seemed purple in the starlight. At first she thought it must be a huge salamander or a toad, but then it spoke to her in a deep gravel voice and said, "What are you doing, trespassing on my mistress's land?" "What are you?" cried Derna, "and what do you want?" "I'm a mudlick," said the hideous creature, "and I want to know why you're trespassing here." "I was thirsty," Derna said. "We are lost." "We?" said the mudlick. "Are there more of you?" "Yes," Derna told him. "There is the Queen's whole train. Have you not seen them?" "No," said the mudlick. "I can see only those things that drink the water. You have drunk and thus can see me. You told me you came to slake your thirst. What of the others?" "We wish to leave." "That's not possible," said the mudlick. "You have chosen to trespass here, so here you must remain." "We did not choose. A windstorm drove us here." "That was not my doing." "But you must let us go," said Derna. "You must." "That I will not," said the mudlick, and turned as if to swim away. "But we will die," cried Derna. "I expect you will," replied the mudlick. "Our water is all gone." "I do not care." And with that the mudlick began to depart. "Oh, please," Derna besought him. "I shall do anything you ask, only let us escape." "No, there's nothing any of you could do for me. I don't need anything from you." "Don't go, don't go," Derna exclaimed. "Is there nothing to be done to make you save us?" The mudlick wagged his head and started to dive under the dark glassy surface when abruptly he stopped. He folded his hands across his slimy chest and trod water for a moment as if listening to the far-off jackal's song, and then he turned around. "There's one thing, perhaps," he said. "Oh, what is it?" begged Derna. "Tell me." "Well," said the mudlick, "my mistress is fond of young boys. Have you any in your train?" "One," said Derna. "There is one." "How old is he?" inquired the mudlick. "He is 6, the nurse replied. Mused the mudlick. "She likes them younger, babes in arms if possible. But I suppose he will do. Who has charge of him?" "I." "Very well. Bring him down to the water and drown him. Then I shall let you go." Derna drew back from the creature a little. "His mother will never consent. She is the Queen." The mudlick shrugged. "As you please," he said. "I only thought to do you a kindness. I suppose he really is too old for my mistress's liking." "I shall do it in secret," Derna said. "I shall tell her the thirst fever took him and he went to the lake and fell in." "Tell her the water witch took him," said the mudlick. "Then she will think you have the fever too and no one will blame you." Then the mudlick swam off and Derna returned to camp. She slipped into the prince's tent where the boy lay sleeping. There she roused him from his cushions and told him to come out to the lake, that there was something great and wonderful to see, but they must make no noise, so as not to wake the others. The young prince went with her willingly enough, for though she had never been very kind to him, she had never given reason to distrust her. So while the distant jackals cried and keened, the two stole out of the camp and down to the lake where the mudlick waited. "See," said Derna, pointing. "There it is." "There is what?" said the prince. "I see nothing." "Lean closer," Derna urged him. "Now do you see?" "No," said the prince. "What must I look for?" "You must lean closer still then," Derna told him. "You will know what it is when you see it." "But I see nothing," said the prince, leaning so far forward his face almost touched the water. "Closer," said Derna. And this time when he leaned, craning to see what she was pointing at, the nurse shoved him hard, so that he fell from the bank and into the lake without so much as a cry. The jackals called. Derna stood watching to see if he would come to the surface, but the water closed over him with hardly a ripple. Then Derna ran back to camp as quickly as she could and burst into the Queen's tent, staring wildly and clutching her throat as though she could not breathe. They were a long time getting any sound from her, and for a while that was only shrieks and wails, but finally, between much tearing of hair and tearing of her cheeks, and tearing at her cheeks with her nails, she began to babble and rave. And half the time she told them the prince had slipped at the lake's edge, and the other half she swore a water witch had caught him by the hair and pulled him in. Finally she fell into a faint at the Queen's feet and could not be roused. Whether the Queen believed one or the other of the tales, I do not know, but most of the people believed the one of the witch. Many said the witch had claimed her tribute and would let them go now. Camp was hurriedly struck and the camels loaded for travel, but the queen saw none of this, for she'd gone to the lake shore to weep for her son. Then when she returned and saw the caravan ready awaiting, she said, "Let us depart. This is an evil place." And this time they found their way out of the canyons and into the desert once more. They soon came upon clear water, and eventually they found their way home. Great was the grief of the king when he found his son was dead. The pilgrimage proved fruitless, for the queen was still barren, and at last her husband was obliged to put her aside, and she removed across the sea of dust to Easterness. The chieftain twice remarried young daughters of neighbouring rulers, but both died very soon and neither conceived. Blight came to the land and killed the cattle and the crops. People began to say the house of the king was accursed, and they drifted away. The king grew old before his time, and at last died without an heir in the plague year that struck down most of the remaining people. Those who were left fled. There was no one to succeed the king, and no one to rule over. The servants took what goods they might from the palace and departed. The palace guard rounded up those who were left to sell for slaves. Dirna was one of these. She had begun to go blind. Ever since she drunk the chill waters of the dark, still lake, her sight had worsened until now both eyes were covered with a white film, and she saw nothing any more of the things of this world. She was sold to the satrap of the steeps of Touraine, who gave her along with the others who could weave and spin as a gift to his half-sister, when she wed the syndic of my village. It is from Dirna I got this tale, and I think perhaps she told it just to frighten me. I don't know if it's true." Iriel fell silent, and sat in the sun on the black slate floor, waiting for some word from the vampire, but no word came. She looked up and saw him staring off across the room, a slight frown marring the unearthly handsome features of his face. "Did you not like the story, my lord?" she asked at last. No expression came into his blank eyes, but his frown deepened a little. "When did this story take place?" he said. His voice was oddly strained. "Years ago," said Iriel, "before I was born." "And where was the kingdom that the chieftain ruled?" the Icarus asked. "Far away from my tiny village, far over the white plain of Averick." "In what quarter?" the Darkangel demanded. His voice was so tight Iriel was startled. "In the west," she answered, in the north and west, I think." The vampire began to pace suddenly, round and about before the window. His shadow glided back and forth over Iriel as she sat in the light of the setting sol star. "What was the name?" "The name of this chieftain," said the Icarus, pacing and not looking at her. One hand was a fist, and the other was gripped and wrung his wrist, as though trying but vainly to work some shackle free. Iriel hesitated. "I do not know," she said. "I cannot remember." "Then you do not remember the tale very well, do you?" the Darkangel snapped. "Forgive me, lord," said Iriel. "I tell the tale as best I can." "The queen!" cried the vampire. "What was the name of the queen?" Iriel had to think a moment long. "Silver," she said finally. "I think it was Silver." "No," said the Icarus, his voice suddenly harsh and loud. "You are not remembering it rightly. It was something else. It was not Silver." Iriel said nothing. The vampire's voice had fallen to a mutter at last. He whirled on her abruptly, toying with his necklace now as if it encircled him too tightly and his shadow hid the light. "Why are you sitting there so silent?" he cried with sudden suspicion. "Answer me! Say it was not Silver!" "As my lord commands," said Iriel, so softly she was afraid he'd not heard. The dull clinking of the leaden vials seemed louder. She held her breath. But the Darkangel nodded and half turned away. He dropped his hand from his throat and leaned against the windowsill. "The boy," he said. "Tell me the prince's name." Iriel was at once afraid to answer him and afraid to remain silent. She said, "I cannot remember," and her whisper trembled, but the Icarus seemed hardly to hear. He was staring down the length of the chamber's windowed wall. Iriel stood up. "You say his nurse pushed him in," the vampire said. Iriel nodded, doubting that he saw. "And his mother went down to the bank and wept for him?" "Wept tears of blood," said Iriel. The Icarus said nothing, and his frown was very deep and dark. His anger was pain to her. "Irilath," said Iriel. "I remember now. The prince's name was Irilath." The vampire shuddered and shook his head. You are mistaken, he told her. There was a terrible quietness to his voice. Behind him, through the window, Solstar shone in white glory, already half hidden by the mountains. In another hour it would be gone. Dark fortnight would descend, leaving only pale stars and waxing Oceanus for light. Iriel stood waiting. Leave me, the Darkangel said, not looking at her. The stillness of his voice frightened her. Do not come again. Iriel said nothing. She did not know what to say, and left him.